Welcome to Behaviorally Speaking Leadership for Changemakers, where leadership is grounded in behavior, guided by dignity, and designed for change. I'm your host, Dr. Esther Bubb. Let's dive into today's episode. Well, Kelleen, it's so much of a pleasure to have you on the show today. I mean, we've been in connection through the field, haven't been in connection directly for a while, but indirectly, right? We made in contact, behind the scenes. So how are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful, and it's an absolute privilege and pleasure to be talking with you again. And I have so much respect for everything that you've been working on and all your projects. So I'm really happy to be a part of it.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Kelleen. And I'm really excited, to see what I'm going to, or see or hear what I'm going to learn from you today. So for our listeners, let's talk a little bit about your story and your leadership journey. So can you tell us, Kelleen, what first drew you to apply behavior analysis, and then how has your leadership and your leadership identity, right, and your philosophy evolved along the way?
Absolutely. So I think it starts with family, actually, is the beginning of my leadership journey and my journey into ABA. And my mom, I would say, taught me just the value of acts of kindness and this being of a service to others. And I think that guiding principle with my family, including my aunts and my cousins, who all have such strong knowledge and strength in supporting and guiding, this idea of taking care of people and doing it in the way in which we can bring our skills to the table. And so she was a pediatric occupational therapist her whole life, my mom, and she worked with a lot of individuals with varying diagnoses and needs. And so she really taught me kind of how to work with that population and how to prioritize it and the meaning behind the work and why we do these things. And that kind of guided me into environments that then were modeling for me the principles of applied behavior analysis and psychology. And I had a wonderful mentor who worked with me when I was a paraeducator in a self-contained preschool classroom, which is, that population that I absolutely love, that our younger population. And she taught me kind of those more specific, very contingencies of ABA. And I learned, discrete trials, and I learned shaping, and I learned modeling and feedback, and I learned potty training, and I learned all these wonderful skills that I found a lot of value in. And when I began to learn those different skills, it clicked, right? There is a button, there's an alarm that went, I love this, and I see the value in it, and I want to do more of it.
Yeah. I really love that, Kelleen. Listening to you, so many ideas went through my head, but just the thought of, you talked about, it started with home, with family, your mom, pediatric occupational therapist, right? Just, it reminds me of every single interaction in our life impacts, right, the path or future, things like that. So from an early age and your interactions with your parents, how that impacted where you are today. And it makes me think, you also talked about your experience as a parent and your mentor, right? And all of those things, how everything we do, it makes me think, Kelleen, everything I do as a behavior analyst, as a mom, as a teacher, as an educator, how it impacts the lives of others, right? And so how critical that is. But then it also leads me into the next question I had for you, because you talked about your mom, right? Pediatric occupational therapist, right? So occupational therapist, it makes me think of healthcare too, right? In that sense. So, but then you, again, similarly to your mom, you've led across schools, you've led across healthcare settings, right? How have those environments collectively, Kelleen, shaped how you lead today?
Sure, absolutely. So I think, and to mention as well, my sister is also an occupational therapist. So it's, she had an impact on all of us, all my siblings, my two sisters. We all went into the field with that same notion of supporting individuals. And so my sister also works in the school district, but she's also worked across healthcare settings. So it's kind of a family thing.
Yeah.
But, the opportunity that I got to go to the AJ Drexel Autism Institute, that really was the beginning of shaping my clinical experience, and the leadership from the clinical core team and people that you know and have worked with well in the past as well, who I respect and admire so much, and who I credit to giving me a lot of the tools that made me so successful in that part of my career. It really cultivated like a leadership style that was collaborative with other clinical minds and backgrounds, them being school psychologists and having so many different experiences, that they brought that to the table. And what I would do is I would ask questions of everyone who I could ask questions of, and learn everyone's different perspectives and leadership styles, because there's so much value in others' experiences, and then how they give you their guidance and leadership. And I would just listen to everyone that I could that was working with me at that time. And I took what they were saying, and I modeled my behavior after it. And so I think it led to a lot of precision, data-driven decision making, especially in the clinical core, because we were doing a lot of high-level federally funded research. So we were adhering to IRB regulations. We were adhering to a lot of treatment fidelity and very structured, assessment. So those types of interventions and ongoing data analysis really emphasize accountability, fidelity, and then those measurable outcomes. So it made me value that consistency, that clarity, and the idea of evidence-based practice.
Yeah.
And then, my school-based training kind of expanded that leadership approach to be more collaborative and flexible and more systems-oriented. So working along with educational settings required me to kind of be able to navigate multidisciplinary teams, align with more district-based priorities, balance the need of other diverse learners within real-world constraints, right? So that meant, just kind of broadening my consensus, coaching educators, and embedding behavioral supports with that broader idea of tiered systems. So having both the clinical and the school-based training together, I think has shaped me into a leader who can move fluidly between precision and pragmatism, and leveraging that data while also prioritizing relationships and collaboration to create long-term sustainable change.
Yeah. I really love all of that. So you talked about flexibility, fluidity, malleability, right? But then you also added at the beginning that your sister, is also an occupational therapist. So it makes me think of, so we're going to segue a bit into systems, leadership, and collaboration. But you talked about collaboration. You talked about so many systems. First of all, your family as a system, right? Your mom, your parents as the lead of that, right? She shaped each of you individually into becoming productive citizens of society, right? So that's your family system right there. And then you're in the school system and the healthcare system. And then in your family, I'm sure you had to collaborate, work together, this is your chore, this is your sister's chore. So you've learned so much, right, Kelleen, along the way. And so that to me started the foundation for who you are today, and your ability to be flexible and just adjust and shift, right? And, code switch, so to speak, right? In these different settings. So as we think of larger systems, Kelleen, and collaboration and all of the wonderful thoughts you've shared so far, and I really appreciate you sharing those stories, right? How do you help practitioners, Kelleen, shift from thinking about just changing individual behavior, just changing Esther's behavior, Kelleen's behavior, her sister's behavior, right? And really shift to a mentality where it's designing as an entire system, like your mom did, an entire system that supports sustainable change?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important to me, actually. It's something that I really, and in my work, at this point in my career with school systems, right, I really focus on that. So I try to shift the lens from, like you said, how do I change this individual's behavior, to reframe it to what is in the environment that's maintaining it, and how do we redesign that environment? And I think that happens through a combination of different strategies. So, and again, not one size fits all approach, right? We might have to try on a few different strategies to see how this system needs to kind of work within this environment.
Yeah.
And those can be really, evolving and changing over time. So I think it's making the things that feel invisible in systems level work more
Yeah.
visible. So like pointing out kind of sometimes when we're looking at patterns, like there's some inconsistent expectations here, or there's gaps in like some of these more proactive supports we provide, and
Yeah.
kind of bringing that to the table. And I think sometimes that's not what everyone wants to hear, but it is important that we make it visible in order to be able to problem solve through it and address it. I model kind of like systems level thinking. I kind of try to connect individual cases to broader like school-wide practices. So showing how like one student's challenges actually can reflect, a predictable change in systems variables for all students.
Yeah.
Building our capacity through giving tools. I like to call it like a tool belt. I'm like, we got to give
like
you,
that.
Here's your tool belt. And like on this tool belt, there's different tools that we have. And it's about when we use certain tools to make us more efficient or effective in assessment, whether we use those tools to make us more efficient and effective in direct intervention, because that's part of a system is kind of moving through processes. And so I kind of really focus on the proactive. That is like a lot of my focus on shifting to proactivity, not just reactivity, and then reinforcing, and strengthening the idea that the more that we're able to create successful systems that lead to the best outcomes for both stakeholders, the less that we need intensive interventions that may not be sustainable over time. It's more of that quick putting out the little problem or solution, but I want to think about like not just addressing that quick little problem, but looking at all of the variables that led up to that we could intervene on to create, just more efficient practices. And hopefully the buy-in and what I work on is getting that buy-in to naturally increase with observable change.
Yeah, I love that because you talked about the environment, you talked about contingencies, right? And for me, yes, all of that, Kelleen, and then also in terms of the systems approach, it's like if multiple people are engaging in this behavior that we don't want to see or where there needs to be improvement, then it's clearly a systems issue. One of the tools, I really liked the tool belt analogy, right? But one of the tools I keep in my tool belt is a reminder, right? ABA, we say pre-corrections, and you talked about being proactive, and I'm really big on that. So, whether it's like, all right, this thing is coming up, I'll just constantly send reminders, not every day, but, ever so often. And staff have said how beneficial that has been to them, because I think of my staff, like I tenor and special education teachers with caseloads and a million things to do, right? And so just if I could send just a little reminder, and they've said that's very helpful. And then you see the change in behavior across the team, right? As opposed to this one person is not submitting this on time. And, this one also is not, and this one also is not. How about we think of it as the system and how we can build and support? So saying all of that, Kelleen, when we talk about systems, we talk about multiple people working together. You've worked with multiple people. How do you build alignment, right? And sometimes that's not always easy to achieve, but what are some of the things you do to build alignment across like different professionals? So educators, clinicians, administrators, psychologists, whomever, right? And of course, families when priorities differ.
Oh yeah, so that is a bulk of the work that I do, on the day-to-day is creating that alignment. And I think that it starts with clarity and shared purpose. And when we look at how we can, get some of our learners to do the things that are hard for them to learn, we really focus on that pairing and being a motivating and highly reinforcing individual. And I kind of look at it as we want all stakeholders to feel like they have a purpose or value in what we're doing. And I think that's really important. And it's kind of valuing that over compliance, right? Or agreement, that's not all collaborative. So like kind of really just looking at, like, we all want the same for our students. We want them to be successful. We want them to be safe. We want them to be able to access the things that we're trying to teach them and for them to be able to learn, and like kind of use that as an anchor. And from there, kind of really establish ways to get your message heard in a way that's going to be accepted, right? Shared language. I think a big part of my work, especially with some of my teachers and other educators that I work with, is taking our technical language in EBA and really making it translate across disciplines. So we all kind of have the same definition. So it means the same thing to everyone at the table, right? And I feel I focus a lot on that, like balancing that way of like bringing technical language to more familiar language or everyday language. Using data not as like making it less of a way people might be defensive about data, right?
Right.
Like, and making it more objective so that it's just conversations from like opinion to problem solving. We're creating a common reference point that like is not a reflection of anything that you're doing wrong, right? It's not a reflection of anything that someone else is doing right. It's more of a reality of what's existing that we need to look at together and use our brains together to kind of problem solve how to move forward. And I try to like take that stigma away from data. How important I know it is, but how it can be perceived, right? And then like, again, perception is a big thing and perspective is a big thing. So making space, for everyone to feel that they have opportunities to communicate, families, educators, clinicians, administrators, so everyone can articulate their priorities, and then connect those priorities and perspectives to how we can work on them together rather than what takes more priority over another thing. And it's like, we all agree that these are priorities. Do we all also agree that we want to shift our focus to number 1 right now, knowing that 2 and 3 still exist, but we may not have the capacity as a team, again, bringing it back to a team systems approach, to address them all at the same time. And if we can all kind of work on this one goal together or this one priority together, and we all feel aligned in that one goal, then we're going to make progress in a much more efficient way, and everyone's going to find the value and reinforcement in it. And then I love defining clear goals, clear roles as well within how we make decisions. I get looked to a lot to help support how do we make a plan, right? Or how does everyone hold a responsibility or a role in this plan, and what does that mean? How does it look, right? And being really explicit about, inclusive about exactly how everyone can kind of facilitate this, knowing that we're not perfect, but we're going to try our best to follow that guidance, especially in the real world, practical, school-based, settings. And then small shared wins, focusing on small shared wins, getting quick buy-in and quick little wins that help build momentum. Because I think when you're able to know that, like, there's one part of a transition that, there's many parts of a transition, but maybe the first part is the thing that is our quick win for today, right? It's the one thing that we're all going to focus our efforts on collaboratively. Here's how we're going to do it. We have our plan in place. And we're just going to focus on this one gaining attention from all the students with one verbal response. That's not the entire transition, right? There's many steps, but we're going to prioritize that. And so I don't aim for like perfect agreement, but I aim for coordinated action. And I think that's the approach that I try to use.
I love that. I don't aim for perfect agreement. I aim for coordinated action. Beautifully said, beautifully summed up. That response, Kelleen, was very rich and loaded with lots of nuggets and takeaways, right? So I really love that thought you should at the end. But you also said a lot of good ideas like small wins. Let's focus on this one thing. Let's do it together. Like, why are we here, right? Essentially, we're here for this. And giving everyone a voice. Everyone has value, sharing their opinions, right? And so it makes me think, Kelleen, of even, and you've probably had similar experiences, so you can also share as well, but when there's disagreement, not just amongst the team, but like I've had, so one experience is with parents. So they're divorced, right? So you have the opinion of the parent, the mom, the opinion of the dad, and the opinion of the team. And in this particular instance, parents were divorced, right? So then you have the school team. You have the preschool team. So the school as in the specialized classroom, the preschool team, the IBHS, right? So the mental health team, and then the rapid response team through the state of Pennsylvania was also involved. And to your point, Kelleen, it was like really focusing on the one thing at that moment, because there were several areas of disagreement, but that the child can access instruction. So the recommendation, so the team met, made the recommendation and sent the NOREP. Dad agreed, approved the NOREP, mom disagreed. And, once we have at least one disagreeing, we can't move forward. So we had the informal meeting. And in the meeting, dad was also agreeing with mom. So then it also begs the question, Kelleen, is everybody having an understanding fundamentally of what we're presenting, what we're talking about, right? And I thought that was really eye-opening for me because first dad approved, but then when he was listening, in that follow-up meeting, the informal meeting, he was then agreeing with the mother, which is totally okay. So we came to an agreement, Kelleen, to focus on access to instruction. So we increased the number of days that he was receiving services in the specialized classroom and said, let's focus on this, right? Let's focus on this. We'll send our behavior analyst out to the school just to consult, the preschool to consult. We'll gather data, as you said, so we don't want the data to be overwhelming. And let's come back together in 30 days, see where we're at, right, and go from there. Have you had like similar experiences?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is a lot of communication. I think what I'm listening and hearing from you is it's creating communication pathways, but also clarifying understanding. I think when we feel that we understand or we feel that we know how to approach a situation, we feel more confident. And when we feel more confident, we feel like we're able to make better decisions, for whether that be our children or, our, family members or students, whoever it may be. Confidence, I think, comes with the idea of support. Someone's there to guide you and support you. And so, like you said, laying out that plan of how we're going to focus and then how we're going to check back in, because like once we identify the plan, the support wheels don't fall off the train, right? They keep chugging, they keep moving. And so that's the idea of having that support through the process, I think, is what makes people feel more comfortable and more confident with some of the changes that can be challenging to understand or to be able to apply.
Yeah, wonderful. So on that note of confidence, right, let's talk a bit about supervision, culture, and staff development. And we know confidence, as you were just saying, Kelleen, is so critical for staff development, right, or personal development, either way we want to think about it. So how do you use things like reinforcement, feedback, and coaching, Kelleen, to shape staff confidence and their performance?
I love performance feedback.
I know you do.
I do.
Yep.
I love coaching, and it comes, going back to kind of like the origin story, right? I was an athlete. I was a very big athlete when I was younger, so I was around a lot of coaching and a lot of feedback, and I had, you get comfortable with coaching and feedback, and you get comfortable with, shaping, and you get comfortable with behavioral rehearsal and modeling and then in moment feedback to shape skills. So I think the more that people feel comfortable with feedback and comfortable with applying that feedback in order to see changes in the people that they're serving, and the more that I can get their buy-in of why it's so important, I mean, that for me, like prioritizing relationships, prioritizing comfortability, prioritizing, that things are difficult and hard, and that's okay, right? There's like creating that safe space is what I've try to do when I'm giving supervision or giving feedback. At times, I think I've had to learn also, like, there's times when to give feedback and perhaps there's times to not, to take a space, to take a breath, to wait to give that feedback because the person's not ready or able to accept it in that moment. Everyone has different learning styles, making sure I evaluate how they learn best and ask them, for social validity, how they learn best. What is something that they feel comfortable with in terms of feedback? What is something they don't feel comfortable with in terms of feedback? Coming to kind of pre-agreements on that before getting into harder, more challenging contingencies. So I think that I use like an in the moment kind of side by side style. And I do that. I've done that clinically, but I've also done that in schools because it shows that I'm willing to kind of do that work and jump in and demonstrate it. As much as I'm willing to coach you in it. And I think, that creates also that idea of, understanding the purpose of why it's so important, but seeing the purpose of why it's so important or seeing how it works when someone else is doing it and then you trying it. I think that helps build confidence. I think that, also understanding that repeated trials and repeated practice to get to that level of fidelity or that level of acquisition is important too. And, I hope they experience more reinforcement than correction to keep that ratio as well of what makes, people feel more capable. Make some of those changes, but coaching is where it all comes together.
Yeah. I love that. You talked about repetition. You talked about practice, right? And so that is something you're big on, something I'm big on too. And the more we do a thing, so Kelleen, the more you did all that you did, now you're just confident, right? You can fly on your own, right? The more I did what I did, and then the more our staff do what they do, they become more confident. But sometimes it's also us giving them the opportunities, right? So they can practice, whether it's, it makes me think of behavior skills training, like the I do, we do, you do, right?
Yeah.
So then I think of confidence, which we've talked about, right, Kelleen, but then there's this idea of engagement, right? So how do you help mentor emerging BCBs, for example, into confident leaders who are also engaging? So let me share a story, right? So in like sort of a checking with a teacher, she said, so there's a teacher, there's the paraprofessional, right? And sometimes we have like, additional staff in the classroom, PCAs or subs, whatnot. So there was a sub in the classroom and the students were actively responding to the sub and not her. And she was like, well, I want them to come to me. Like they were responding to the sub, but not to me. And the difference was the engagement. The sub, they were on the playground, got down, he was down on the child's level, interacting, engaging, right? So you're building that trust, that relationship. And so, the conversation then became, well, what are some behaviors you can do, teacher, to get, students really engaged, wanting to come to you, for example. So saying all of that, like it's a difference between that active engagement and, the lack of active engagement, right? It really makes a difference. So both confident, one just had more of an engagement, mentality. And it makes me think of leaders who are engaging with staff, going into classrooms, going into the field, observing things like that. So how can you help mentor them, or what do you do to help them say, yeah, I'm confident I can lead, but I also need to engage?
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with you 100%. Engagement is so important. It helps, prepare and pave that pathway for behavior change. So I think a few practices that I found effective is kind of scaffolding opportunities for leadership. So like kind of like that gradual release of responsibility to kind of have them facilitate or lead more. While I kind of take that step back to provide support behind the scenes and give them that confidence again. But I think engagement, is also people when you walk in the hallway, saying hello and good morning, even if it's a hard day for you, normalizing growth and discomfort as well, like normalizing like that something didn't work out the way that we thought it would, and that's okay. And it doesn't feel comfortable. It doesn't feel great sometimes when those things happen, but it's a normal part of the learning process. encouraging their voice and autonomy 100%. I like to
Yeah.
actively invite like their perspectives, especially when they differ from mine,
Yeah.
to kind of understand their clinical judgment. That's a practice I think I learned from you. I will say I remember distinctly that this is something that you would do a lot when we would speak, is kind of inviting a perspective to understand you know, where they differ or where they align, and then being able to explain that is you know, an important part of a consultation, an important part of behavior.
Yeah.
To explain like why this is an important thing to do or why I feel this way.
Yeah.
And then like feedback on their presence, not just their practice. So beyond technical skills, right? We're coaching on communication style. We're coaching on how you show up in a room. We're coaching on why it's important to kind of think out loud, right? Like it's okay to think out loud. You know, it's not just about how you practice something, but it's about how you present it. And I think that too is an important part of the supervision process. And I think my goal is always like to give them the skills that where they can be as strong clinicians as possible, understand the dimensions of ABA, is like why they're so important, you know, and but also give them opportunities to be leaders that can engage people and engage teams of people, can navigate different systems and drive meaningful change, not just confidence, but also humility, right? Like there's a certain humbleness that has to come with, you know, creating relationships with people.
Yeah, I love that. And you mentioned, you know, helping them understand why the basic principles, the dimensions, right, are important. It made me think of generalization as one of those, because it brings me back, Kelleen, to the example I just gave. And the largest issue in that example I gave where the NORP was disapproved was the lack of generalization, right? So we're seeing the success, we're seeing progress in the specialized education setting, but not generalizing to the preschool. So, and then therein lies the engagement that we talked about, right? So we're confident in our decisions, we're confident as leaders, but how are we engaging with the preschool? So behavior analysts, you know, go out, do a monthly consult, right? So that to me was is a critical component of how we support leaders with learning, with shaping their behaviors and engaging. Those fundamental dimensions too are very critical, especially for behavior analysts. And saying all of that, it takes me to the topic of like ethics and current issues, right? We know ethics is so big, not only in ABA, but in any profession, right? In any field, just individually, if we just think of morality, for example. But it often goes beyond compliance, Kelleen, right? Just beyond checking the boxes. So like I think of like advocating against practices that prioritize billing, right, over client outcomes, right? Let's just bill, but the child is not making progress. Or let's just continue, going back to the preschool example, let's just continue recommending this even though child is not, you know, skills are not generalizing to the preschool. So in thinking of ethical leadership beyond compliance, what does ethical courage look like, Kelleen, in practice? For example, saying, well, this is not okay that we're billing, but the child is not making progress.
Yes, I think ethical courage, it's showing up in the moments where doing the right thing is not the easiest, fastest, or most popular opinion, right? And it's not about being, you know, rigid. It's about being transparent and principled and willing to act in the client's best interest, either when it requires advocacy or when it requires discomfort. So I think it's, you know, it's about following certain guidelines that you feel strong about and passionate about, like such as prioritizing client dignity and so, you know, supporting long-term outcomes instead of short-term, applying data and our ethics code and as, you know, as ways to guide that these are going to be here and grounded in practice regardless, right? Of what the situation is. We're going to use what's grounding us, and we're going to stay the course with it. And then I think willing to take on responsibility and being accountable. I think when your decisions are, you know, questioned, or you feel unsure about an ethical practice. I think it's about taking responsibility and being accountable, and like going back to look and being objective about your own behavior and looking at it and saying, okay, maybe this is an area that next time I'm going to try to do it a little differently, or I recognize that this was not the best idea in this current moment. Let me work collaboratively with the team and go to my leadership or go to my supervisor and, figure out a better way to do it, or figure out a way that makes me feel better about doing it, or figure out what the barriers are that are in our way from making meaningful, lasting change. And I think as a leader, I try to eliminate those barriers as best I can. And when I do encounter one, I have to look at creating buy-in from stakeholders in order to make sure they understand the priority of the barrier I see, because I might see it as a different barrier than they may see it.
Right. 100%. And it brings me back to your response to 2 questions ago, where you talked about the why, right? Having those meetings, sharing different perspectives, and really talking about the why. So hoping those, even ourselves, because you talked about reflection, right? And so we all are, reflective practitioners. So like, why did this happen? What can I do differently? Why is this happening? What should I change, right? Why is this not okay? And what do we need to do? So I think it's having those conversations, but supporting people with being brave enough, right, to have those conversations, being brave enough to advocate, being brave enough to step up, right, to identify the thing as what the thing is, right, and not continue to try to hide it.
Yes.
And right, it's so hard, Kelleen. It's so hard sometimes. Like even, myself included, we just have to take the first step, or even if you need someone to support, even like I'm thinking of like mandated reporter calls, right? We always say to our staff, you're the mandated reporter. You have to make the decision. We're here to support. So if you need us to be on the call with you, we're here to support you. So sometimes people want to make the right decision. They just need some support, right? And that's okay, right?
I've asked those questions myself many times. I'm like, okay, here's the situation I have. What do you think is the best, most ethical way to approach this? And I take the guidance that has been given to me as I was learning, and I still use to this day a lot of the things that Dr. Connell shared with me, and the wonderful clinical core team that I worked with. So I take their guidance and their support that they gave to me in those moments, and I try to replicate it, right? Just like you're saying, it takes some bravery.
Yes, absolutely. So, when, we did our work together, Kelleen, and, years ago, there's hot topics. There's always hot topics and trends and, evolutions in the field. And so compassionate care, Kelleen, is a growing conversation in ABA. I've always been big about compassionate care, big about, just everyone's a human. You talked about dignity, respect, right? So how has, hot topics or current topics such as compassionate care, assent-based rights, services, or trauma-informed practice even, right, really influence your leadership approach, Kelleen?
Yeah, absolutely. So it looks different, in the different settings that you're in. But I would say it's about shifting the focus to like, we need to change this behavior, right? Should we? And how do we do so in a way that respects autonomy, safety, and dignity? And that means looking at ways to do more antecedent-based interventions, I think. And so that means prioritizing how I build rapport, offering choices, honoring assent and withdrawal, and ensuring like interventions that are effective but humane and contextually appropriate, right? And this, I think, the way I look at it is modeling, number one, and compassion and compassionate interactions with both clients and staff, right? Both ways. So when I have a situation where there's like a highly aggressive child and the staff is feeling, very flustered and anxious about it, and like the students also feeling that way, right? So we have to our compassion for both the staff and the student in that moment. And we set the tone for how they treat each other, or guide how the tone should look, and reinforce it. And shifting how we measure success into including engagement in that definition, including trust, and
Yeah.
including quality of life, not just a reduction of interfering behaviors that
Mhm.
that we're trying to help support the student with.
Yeah.
I think it's also creating kind of this idea of psychological safety. You
Yeah.
can ask questions, you can express concerns, and you can slow down when something doesn't feel right for both the student and the client or the staff
Yeah.
member. And then
Yeah.
embedding those trauma-informed principles. So predictability, choice, collaboration, building those into systems, and our training, right? And how we
Yeah.
train others, and not just treating them as add-ons, but treating them as priorities, right? So
Yeah.
I've been doing a lot of work where I've been trying to really train to trauma-based informed care,
Yeah.
because it's something that we're seeing more and more of
Mm-hmm.
in our school systems, and it requires like ongoing reflection, I think, and learning different
Yeah.
ways to approach a goal, and learning
Yeah.
different ways to seek guidance and feedback, and learning different ways to evolve our practice.
Yeah.
It's about learning how to be compassionate, and that it's not separate from effective ABA care.
Yeah. Yeah.
It goes hand in hand, and it
Yeah.
strengthens it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's my job as a leader to try to strengthen those systems,
Mm-hmm.
and our intentions.
Yeah. 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 100%. And you talked about, starting with us, right? That shift, we have understanding that, yeah, we can talk about a decrease in behavior, but is it a necessary decrease, right? Or is it the intervention we're recommending something that's humane or something that's practical? And you mentioned social validity earlier, even in these instances, right? But the larger idea, Kelleen, that the compassionate care starts within us, right? With us. So it makes me think of, the behavior analytic mind, like what does compassionate care, how do we operationalize it? What does it look like? What does it mean? Like, how do we define it? And so once we have that co-understanding starting with us, inside us, within us, then within our organizations, and you talked about training, how are we training? What content are we including? So with, right, us, our organizations, before we can even reach the clients, Kelleen, right? Because if we don't understand it, it makes me think of an analogy I use all the time. My car isn't starting, but I don't know why, and I don't understand the why. Like, I can't solve the problem, So the fact that we have to understand it before we can even do it, our organizations have to adopt that mentality before it even reaches the clients, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So in thinking of all of that, it makes me think of change and innovation, right? Changing our minds, changing ourselves, changing our fields. And when you think about the future of behavioral leadership, right? What, Kelleen, gives you, Kelleen the person, what gives you hope? And what do you, Kelleen, as a person, believe needs to change?
So I think that what gives me hope is that there's starting to become a clear shift towards more humane, collaborative, and
Mm,
context like practices, like context
okay.
aware practices. Like there's a specific context, like that we're aware of,
Yeah.
that we're now looking at through a lens, rather than throwing it through an overarching kind of collection of behaviors. And I think there's momentum kind of growing around, like you said, like assent-based care and compassionate integration with our educational and mental health systems in particular. And I think that big thing that I am a proponent of is shifting beyond isolated interventions into
Mm,
system-wide impact,
yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
asking better questions, right? Which means
Yeah.
we're evolving.
Yeah.
And then I do think that it's about closing the gap between what we know and what we do.
Yeah.
And if we can close that gap between what we know and what we do, we can ensure that we're being compassionate, that we're utilizing evidence-based practices consistently, and we're not just discussing them, we're implementing them,
Yeah.
between, the technicality to the real life application. So I think the future of behavioral leadership really depends on the willingness to hold both of advocating our science while
Hmm.
examining the impact of how we apply it.
Wonderful. I loved the asking better questions, right? Because sometimes it starts with the question, right? And how we shape the question, how we word it, things like that. So I like that. And that will be my Monday morning move. Ask better questions. So to close us out, Kelleen, what is one Monday morning move you would offer our listeners, right? Look, for example, asking better questions. You gave one already, but is there another one you can offer that they can implement tomorrow?
Sure, yeah, I have a few Monday morning moves.
Okay, all right, let's hear them.
My first thing, a Monday morning move I really believe in is I take a look at my inbox. I look at my inbox and I go through all of my communication and I look at it and I go, okay, what did I follow up, prioritize?
Yeah.
There was time in between my response. What do I need to set myself up for the week with in order to make sure that I am supporting everyone that needs my help and assistance in the way that works best? And that's about a lot of organization and preparing and planning. I'm a very big planner, and I think you know that about me.
Yes.
I am looking at, preparing myself, planning for the week, looking at what needs to take priority, establishing scheduling, and then finding the resources that I need for those specific meetings, for that specific observation, for that specific consult, and then looking at making sure that I can fit all of that into the time allocated as best I can. And knowing that could change,
True, at any moment. Yes.
And being flexible. I think it's pausing before jumping into something too, is like a Monday morning thing, is like taking a pause and reflecting on it and preparing and saying, okay, does this need my immediate attention, or is this something that we can address in a different way? It moves from that reactive space to that problem solving proactive space. Take a look at that email. I understand that that's important to you. I get it. I want to make it a priority and important to me too. But let's look at the best way to do that without jumping into something that's going to be emotionally and or physically draining in a reactive way. But again, shifting back to that proactive way. So, just try to stop and think and prepare and plan and address on my Monday morning so that I set myself up for a little bit of a consistent week as best I can.
I love that. I actually smiled at the check my inbox and prioritize. Yes. Well, Kelleen, thank you so much for being on the show today. Thanks for sharing your insight, your stories. I love the stories you share, especially your family story. That was very heartwarming. It was a pleasure catching up, and I definitely wish you all the best in all you do. Thank you so much.
I wish the same for you, and I'm very appreciative that we got a chance to connect again. Thank you so much, Esther.
You're very welcome. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Behaviorally Speaking Leadership for Changemakers. Be sure to visit esthercbubbabaservices.com/blog for today's companion blog and additional leadership resources. Until next time, create the conditions for growth wherever you lead. I'm Dr. Esther Bubb. Stay inspired.